FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
This episode of the Financial Survival Network is brought to you in part by Sandstorm Gold Royalties. Sandstorm Gold Royalties is a different kind of gold company. They purchase royalties on select mining operations and receive a percentage of the revenue in return. Sandstorm now has a portfolio of over 185 gold royalties around the world. See how gold royalties differ from other gold mining investments at sandstormgold.com. That's sandstormgold.com. Sandstorm Gold Royalties trades on the TSX as SSL and on the New York Stock Exchange American as SAND.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz, and it's 12/5/18. Hey, got a very special guest for you today, somebody who is going to help you understand better than perhaps I can and numerous others that you've heard on the show, the basic reasons why Austrian economics works and why we need it more than ever, and perhaps why it's never going to be implemented. And his name is Dr. Richard Ebeling. Dr. Ebeling, you're currently a professor at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. You've written numerous books about Austrian economics, even finding an archive of papers of Ludwig von Mises, arguably the most prominent Austrian economist, and finding them in the what was the former Soviet Union, and then translating them and helping unearth that treasure and bring it to worldwide discussion. Hey, as always, if you've got any questions for myself or the good doctor, just email us, kl@kerrylutz.com. So, Dr. Ebeling, welcome to the show. First of all, it's great to have you on. And just tell us, is Austrian economics relevant at this point? Does it hold the promise of a solution to many of society's problems that seem to be insoluble? And how do we get, if that is true, how do we get more people involved in this movement, if you will?
Well, I think that to start off with, Austrian economics is relevant because all it is about the logic and the nature and the workings of human activity. That you mentioned Ludwig von Mises. He wrote a book called Human Action. It's his major 900-page treatise on all facets of the logic and the application of economics. But he titled it Human Action because what he meant to emphasize is that it's what all of us do. All of us are conscious, intentional, meaningful human beings who have goals in mind. We try to find means to achieve them. We find that the means at our disposal are not always in the quantities or the types that we can achieve all of our goals. It forces the necessity of choice and trade-offs for all of us. We have to weigh the costs and the benefits. And in this setting, we find that there are opportunities of gains from trade with others. Someone has something that I would like that I can't produce myself or in the same quantity or at the same cost, yet I reciprocally can supply him with something he would like to have that he doesn't have the ability to produce or not as cost efficient as me. And there are mutual gains from trade. And from this, society emerges. That is the basis of the world in which we take for granted. And through that development of 2 people trading and then 3 and 4 and dozens and thousands, millions, and now in our world, billions. People are able to improve their circumstances by specializing in what they're better at in a division of labor and trading their specializations for that of others. And therefore, our standards of living are far above the life of the primitive, which was the condition of all of humanity for thousands of years. The Austrians, particularly an Austrian economist who was a complement and a colleague of Mises, named Friedrich Hayek, hammered away that matching the division of labor is an inescapable division of knowledge. Each of us knows things that the others do not. And if we're all to benefit from what our fellow human beings both know and can do, then we must have some way to communicate with each other. And that means of communication that enables people in China or India to know that there are goods that they could provide to Americans and Americans vice versa to them is through this vast network of market prices, which are the reflections of people stating as demanders what value they place on items they'd like to buy, or the prices at which, given their own circumstances, they'd be willing to produce and sell something. And this binds all of us together. And the importance of this all does occur and can only occur when government basically leaves it alone. What is it when government is involved? Well, we often talk about the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and that there's freedom of speech. Well, I suggest that the free market system and its system of supply and demand established prices by which we communicate with each other is a form of speech. We tell each other what we want, what we could produce, what we would be willing to pay, what price we'd be willing to accept. And therefore, we connect all of ourselves, even though we don't have to know each other personally. I've often thought that the right of market-based prices, the freedom to communicate with each other in this manner, should be protected by the First Amendment. It is a freedom of speech, a medium form of communication. If I put my hand over my mouth, all you will hear is a muffled sound. You will not know the words I'm trying to convey to you. Well, the same thing applies when government either abrogates or tries to restrict and control prices. It prevents you and me and everyone else to communicate with each other in ways that are mutually beneficial. Now, this type of basic core insight, I would argue, is what makes Austrian economics not merely relevant yesterday and today, but tomorrow. And why what you need is an economic and legal system in which individuals are protected in their individual rights to life, liberty, and honestly acquired property, but in which they are otherwise free to set their own goals, establish their own purposes, decide how best to try to achieve the ends that they have in mind, and to freely and peacefully and honestly act with their neighbors. And that is the basis of prosperity as well as liberty.
And I agree with a lot that you say, and I want to talk about China. But first, before we get into that, we've got a situation now on the internet where its very openness and freedom is leading to censorship. Censorship by Google, censorship by Facebook, censorship by Twitter. And these entities have really attained near monopoly or oligopoly status as the disseminators of information, and they are actively squelching those who dissent with their view of the world. Now, on the one hand, we could say let the market handle it. All these people with dissenting views will go form their own channels. But what we see here is when there's an opinion they don't agree with, they'll get them deplatformed. They'll get their URL knocked off the web. They'll get payment systems. They'll get them thrown out of those. And really, this is a case where the government's more or less kept its hands off. You could argue that it did help develop the internet, and perhaps some of these companies, covertly or overtly, had a hand in building them to the powerhouses they are today. But is there a free market solution for this type of thing, or is this where the government needs to get in and be the referee rather than the lawgiver, if you will?
It's interesting that you should ask me this question because, and honestly, I was walking my dog this morning, and with my earphones in, I was on my phone watching a video that John Stossel did on this very issue. And it is the case that because of various political, philosophical, ideological, and cultural biases, Facebook and Google do use their algorithms, they say impartially, but in fact that end up being biased to various political or ideological or philosophic views. The question is that, and it always is that if we say that because there seem to be these problems and frustrations, that something needs to be done and something needs to be implemented to prevent these private sector controllers and of news and information dissemination from seemingly being operating in this biased way. The question is in compared to what? You had mentioned, should government step in? Well, we could have government step in. But remember, the government ultimately makes these decisions on the basis of their ability to have the legal use of compulsion and force. The government would set the standards. It would then be the government standards of bias or unbiased. What type of information was considered proper content and what would be considered culturally undesirable or socially dangerous. If we leave it free the way it is relatively now, and if this type of seeming abuse and misuse of filtering information were to continue and to be sufficiently disturbing and disrupting to enough people, in the private market, there will inevitably be motives, incentives, creative opportunities to devise alternative platforms, alternative means of disseminating information. Let me give an example of this. Think back. I'm old enough to remember before cable TV, when you basically watched TV through the antenna on your roof, and you had three basic networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC. And since I've tended to be philosophically inclined towards individual liberty and limited government since I was a teenager, I remember that I would watch the news shows, Huntley and Brinkley, even the sacred Walter Cronkite, and what you would see there is that if you were conservative or libertarian, you felt that there was bias. Something has to be done about their bias. Well, technology solved that problem in an open market. And that was cable TV and now satellite television, the internet, so that, in fact, your views can be articulated. I work with a nonprofit free market organization, and every week the president of that organization and I do a podcast talking about the kind of ideas that you do on your show. We do ours as a video as well as an audio. And as a result, the market offered opportunities. Now, in this new setting, there are some large companies such as Google and Facebook. But I personally have more confidence, without being able to plan the future, I have more confidence that if these problems are considered serious enough, the market that is creative, innovative, profit-seeking individuals will see niches to fill to break out of these seemingly algorithm biases and to offer people the greater variety of knowledge and information and sourcing that they seem to desire or feel that they're being restricted about. So it's really basically this temporary problem of Google and Facebook versus the dead hand and the heavy hand of government regulation, which will then be far harder to break out of once it's in place.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. However, we do have this concept of the common carrier, okay, where going back to the 1800s, railroads, it's like they couldn't give you a political test whether or not they, you could have admission to the train or the bus, or whether you were shipping a package. Well, how do you feel about God? They couldn't ask these questions. Same thing with phone companies. Could not give you a litmus test before they said, well, we don't like your message. You can make 911 calls or emergency calls out, but nobody's going to be able to call you. And, we've dealt with these types of things before through government action, and it appears to have worked. I'm not sure what the price was of that, but at some point, a company has so much power like a Google where they can sway elections and really abuse the power. I know that government regulation, just its unintended consequences, opens up a Pandora's box, and then once the government gets in, you can never get rid of them, and then regulatory capture, all these things. But is there perhaps a way that they can empower individuals, Internet Bill of Rights or whatever, the governments, we're not going to actually talk about speech or regulate it. All we're going to do is pass an Internet, say, Bill of Rights, what you're entitled to on sites, that you can't be discriminated against due to point of view. Is there a middle ground that can work, or are we just have to wait for the free market to work its accepted magic and its miraculous consequences, but maybe it's 30 years from now, and maybe these companies have helped totalitarian forces take over to the point where we can't do anything then.
Well, I'm perhaps sufficiently suspicious based upon my understanding as well as my reading of history. And perhaps I'm a bit more suspicious than you, which is fair. Everybody interprets these things differently. But I'm far more concerned that once you turn these things over to the hands of government, even when it seems to be in the hands of some type of impartial general statement or supposedly an unbiased commission that would oversee and police it, that invariably it will be politicized in itself. As I like to tell my students when they sometimes say, but doesn't government need to regulate this or manage that or do something else? I say, well, it's all very well and good to suggest that. When your vision is, well, if this government agency or regulatory body was in place, they would do it in a way that you approved of. Now ask yourself one question. Imagine that the politician who you trust the least and hate the most was in charge, either himself or of appointing the commissioners. Have a nice day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I totally agree. And that's the danger of allowing government to get into anything. But we're so far past that now in our society. And, these large corporations are also to some extent beneficiaries of this system. So, I'm not sure what the solution is. I'm not sure that hands-off is really going to work. I do agree with you because, look, 30 years ago, when we were a lot younger, they broke up AT&T, and we got this incredible telecommunications system that resulted from it, and it would have never happened. Or maybe it was almost 40 years ago when they dissolved the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and then we got this massive increase in air traffic that effectively the government was holding back. So we know there's bad things that result from government intervention into the free market and making it less free and less productive, less innovative, all those things. So a balance, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm always curious to hear what the libertarian side of the equation is, because I think it's never factored into these policy decisions, and it really needs to be. So let's switch gears now. We've got a so-called trade war with China that it appears they've taken a brief truce, a hiatus, while they work things out. Now, ideally, we'd have free trade and no government intervention, et cetera. But, what do you do when the country that's really, starting to dominate you is actually an enemy of the country, shipping bad goods? Like a perfect example, the Oakland Bay Bridge, all of this faulty steel that's barely holding it up now could have been an overt act of the Chinese government. I mean, you can't say that it wasn't. And then you see theft of intellectual property. We could get into whether there should be intellectual property or not, whether that impedes progress and innovation. But we do have it, and they act against it. And we do other things too. The U.S. is not blameless in this equation here by any stretch. But what about where two countries are becoming enemies? Is free trade, does it have a place in that relationship? Is it going to bring the parties together? Because we don't live in this Austrian economic world where the individual really is sovereign and government's just there to provide a few essential services. What's the solution here?
Well, let's suppose we could go into a time machine and go forward, let's say 20 or 30 years into the future. And China has become stronger and militarily more pronounced. And some conflict has resulted in a lot of saber rattling. There's even the fear of an actual war. And imagine that in Beijing, the Chinese capital, there's a knock on the door of one of the prominent Chinese communist officials, maybe a senior fellow in the Chinese military. And the person knocking on the door goes in, and the visitor says, "Hi, Pop," and it's the son of this general or high party official. Mm-hmm. And the son says to his dad, Dad, what are you planning to do? You're going to nuke San Francisco? Don't you know that I recently invested in Silicon Valley there, and I bought a condo on top of the mark, and your daughter-in-law and grandkids are there on an extended holiday? What do you mean you're going to start a nuclear war? That type of economic interdependency of mutual investment, mutual buying and selling, it doesn't assure that a war does not occur, because people do stupid things for many irrational reasons. How do I know that? Just look at the history of mankind. Yeah. But having said that, the more that you develop these types of economic interdependencies, the more you raise the cost of going to war, and the more incentive there is to think twice before you nuke your buyer or incinerate your supplier. And therefore, directly and indirectly, have these negative impacts on yourself. So I believe that that the growing interdependency between the United States and China, and in fact, many other countries around the world, has the potential, and I underline the word potential, has the potential to make the motives and the gains from such wars more costly, more negative. And as a result, having those types of interconnections and interdependencies work in the right directions, speaking in the broad brushstroke.
Yeah, and
I'm less bothered by the fact that we buy so much from China, or that we have so many dealings with them. As far as, if I can just sort of go down the list of a few of the things that you mentioned, if I can take a minute or two.
Yeah, please.
Let's take the intellectual property. I understand that there's a lot of controversy, particularly among classical liberals and libertarians, on should there be intellectual property, should it not? I don't want to get into that. As yourself, you sort of like set it aside for a moment. Let's just take for granted that there is intellectual property. You can have a property right in an idea and the physical form of that idea, just as we normally think of these things. Anyway, so now an American business wants to invest in China. And the rules of the game in that country, in some instances, may be that if you want to partner with this Chinese company or supplier or retail outlet, requires you, under that country's rules of the game, to have to share some of your intellectual property, that is your proprietary knowledge about how to do something or manufacture something, et cetera, et cetera. As far as I'm concerned, that's the private matter of that American company. If they value enough having entree and access to the Chinese market, given the cost and benefit of profit opportunities, both investing in China or another country, or doing more investing in production right here in the United States, they have to weigh those costs and the benefits. And if they choose to play by those roles, well, that's the rules of the game. The same way, reciprocally, the United States has rules, good or bad, but there are rules saying that if certain foreign companies coming from certain countries wish to invest in the United States, they're not allowed to have 51% ownership, particularly, for example, in military-related sectors of the economy, of the U.S. economy. Well, then that's the terms of the rules of the game. If a foreign investor X wants to invest in an American company that is viewed as part of the defense network, broadly defined, he may not be able to have 51% control of that U.S. company. If that's not attractive to him, he invests someplace else in another part of the world, or stays investing and making profits in his own home country. Those are just the rules of the game. So I'm really not as bothered by that. And I would prefer that the United States does not counter-politicize that in some type of tit-for-tat reciprocity. Yeah. Then the other element of this, as I see it, is that if the Chinese, let's say, an accusation that some people make is that the Chinese subsidize exports to the United States. Now, that means that the Chinese government gives either a tax break or an actual cash transfer to one of their domestic companies to be able to sell in the United States for less than they could profitably do so if they had to cover their own manufacturing costs, transportation costs across the Pacific Ocean, and then retailing of it in the United States. Now, where does that subsidy money come from? Well, from Chinese taxpayers. The Chinese taxpayer is the one who is seeing a part of their earned income siphoned off to subsidize a privileged and favored and preferred company in China. They're the ones who should be complaining about this, because if a good comes to the United States below its cost of production, that's like a gift. We are getting a product for less than otherwise it would cost us, leaving extra money in our pockets as American consumers to be able to buy other things that otherwise we could not afford. So in a sense, the Chinese are giving us a partly free gift in doing so if they wish to impose unfair tax burdens on their own citizenry. If now, as Trump says, we need to respond to this by retaliatory tariffs, and he says, well, look at this, the Chinese are paying all these import duties. Well, the fact is it's the American consumer that pays the import duties through the higher price of the product. Because if the Chinese company is going to make a profit, it has to cover its own manufacturing expenses, as I said, its transportation costs to get the product from China to the United States, and they now pay that import duty to the American Customs Bureau. That means that they have to price the product, including all of those costs, including the import duty. So now the higher retail price of their product is including that tariff, and that's what the American taxpayer is paying. So really, it's the American consumer who is paying this, not the Chinese. So we're being punished. Now, if I could use an example, it was a 19th century British economist, and he used the following analogy. Suppose that France imposes an import duty on British goods. And that, in a sense, is a slap on one side of the face of the British economy. Mm-hmm. And the British government decides to retaliate and impose similar duties on French goods. Well, as he suggests, that's like slapping yourself on the other cheek, but only even harder. Because now you've disadvantaged some British companies wanting to sell in France by making it more costly for them to do so. But you now hurt yourself by imposing counter duties that make French goods even more expensive for the British consumer. Well, the analogy, of course, would be between China and the United States. Yes. But why do you punish yourself for those policies that other countries are following? At the end of the day, I think that it is better for the United States to follow, that is the government, to follow a unilateral policy of free trade. We get subsidized goods or less expensive goods if the Chinese government wants to burden their citizens with subsidies and other transfers. And we have less expensive goods, freeing up our resources and our dollars in our pockets to be able to produce things and buy things and enjoy things that otherwise would be beyond our reach, if not for their irrational own domestic policies. So in the long run, I don't see a problem. And the more intensified these interdependencies, as I began with, the more you make it costly to try to break them off through war or conflict in some way.
Yeah. All right. I understand your position fully, and I do sympathize with it. And governments, this is what they do. This is what their power derives from. This is what they're about. So I wanted to talk to you about competing currencies and other such things, but we're kind of out of time right now. But I really want to have a discussion with you about deficits, about currencies, about cryptocurrencies, and where all that's heading, your opinion on it. So promise me you'll come back next time and we can really get into that.
I would be delighted. I appreciate your kindness in having me on and the opportunity to exchange ideas and to articulate how I see things. So I appreciate the time with you.
And likewise, really an honor and a privilege to be talking with you about this. Somebody who's been in the weeds longer than I have. And sometimes it's felt hopeless, but sometimes, since the financial crisis, the so-called financial crisis of 08, 09, it's really kind of come into its own here. It's really made a big difference. It's invaded the debate, much to the Keynesians and the traditionalists' chagrin. And for that, we're hopeful. We see more and more colleges offering the Austrians' perspective. So for that, you have to be applauded because you've been such a contributor, you and so many others. So, if you haven't taken a bow yet, it's probably time to, Doctor. And we thank you for that. Hey, where's the best place for people to read your work these days? Do we go to Mises.org or?
Actually, I do a weekly column, and it appears on the website of the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER.org.
Okay, great.
And if they just do it through the little search box, put in my name, Richard Ebeling, that's Ebeling, you'll get a list of all of my weekly articles that I've been starting to do for them now for several months. And even more of my articles on the website of the Future of Freedom Foundation, FFF.org. And there you'll find far more articles by me going back, it's embarrassing, like about 25 years.
All right. Well, you're looking pretty good considering how long you've been doing this for. We really appreciate it. Hey, we'll have a link to the sites in the show notes to this interview. Any questions, comments for Dr. Ebeling or myself, just email us, kl@kerrylutz.com, Twitter feed @KerryLutz, Facebook page, Financial Survival Network. Yes, they're still carrying us. And if you're listening on YouTube, please subscribe, like, and share. If you're just listening to it through a podcast, just share us with somebody. Let these ideas get out. The ideas in the end are what win ahead of everything else, whether it's armed conflict or crazy leftists melting down all over the place. The ideas, I do believe, Doctor, and I'm sure you do too, eventually the ideas will triumph.
Yes, ideas have consequences. And if it's free, the right ideas tend to win in the long run.
All right. Hey, well, it's great having you on. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.